circumpolar terrestrial environment and its coupling to the Arctic Ocean, sea ice, and atmosphere. The project will connect studies taking place throughout the Arctic and across disciplines in order to generate new insights into northern geosystems, ecosystems, and human systems. And key aspects that will be addressed include connectivity, gradients, extreme events, and emergent properties. And then, of course, the data is going to be the data stuff. And then T-MOSAIC is going to run in parallel to the IASC Ocean Atmosphere Project Multidisciplinary Observatory for Studies of the Arctic Climate, MOSAIC. And there'll be temporal overlap in 2019 to 2020 and exchange of certain data sets such as climate observations from the land-based stations. So that's the working executive summary right now for T-MOSAIC. I think it is important to parse the acronyms, so I kind of broke them out right here. I want people to know, and we discussed this a lot at the first T-MOSAIC workshop that I attended, or maybe the second one, about what MOSAIC actually meant in T-MOSAIC. The MOSAIC project, this big Arctic Ocean observational expedition that's going to be kicking off in fall of 2019, excuse me, that's right, stands for Multidisciplinary Drifting Observatory for Studies of Arctic Climate. And again, it's a big observation campaign effort. They've been planning it for probably a decade now, and there's a large emphasis on scientific understanding and process studies. T-MOSAIC, something that's a little bit different, is, first of all, you've got the T, which stands for terrestrial. There's also a focus on multidisciplinary. However, instead of drifting observatory, they're talking about distributed observatories, plural. And for studies of, instead of climate, there's emphasis on connections. So instead of having a major campaign effort, the idea is we're going to synthesize major existing ongoing observing infrastructure, and that there will also be an eye towards transition to services and human systems. So this diagram here, those of you that are familiar with MOSAIC, and I realize from the ecosystem and the terrestrial communities, you may not be that familiar with what's going on with MOSAIC. They originally had a diagram here clustered around climate models, and they were talking about the separate discipline components of what was going to comprise MOSAIC. So that was sea ice, ocean, ecosystems, atmosphere, and biogeochemical cycles. And as we developed the thinking about the T-MOSAIC, we actually sort of expanded this diagram. I think Marcus Rex came up with this originally, and I came up with this modification. And so we now have this sort of combined thing. So what's added in T-MOSAIC is things with people, land and water, the terrestrial ecosystems, the coasts, and I think we've sort of added into the atmosphere section looking about the hydrological cycles. And I guess the question is whether it's in here, these biogeochemical cycles, atmosphere, hydrological cycles, and coasts, are those sort of going to be the connectors in terms of what's going on between MOSAIC and T-MOSAIC? I'm going to read the existing science question for MOSAIC right now, which is what are the causes and consequences of an evolving and diminished Arctic sea ice cover, again with a strong emphasis on the processes. And for T-MOSAIC, it's what are the implications of the changing sea ice, oceanography, and climate of the Arctic oceans for the surrounding land-based geosystems, ecosystems, and chemosystems. One thing here I wanted to emphasize is even though we had this diagram and things were broken up into the little balls of disciplines that we often have on these kind of charts, I think that what we really need to be starting to work on is this emphasis on these linkages right now between these systems, and we probably need to start building, we probably need to build this diagram out more with linkages in between things like biogeochemical cycles, land and water, atmosphere and ecosystems, etc. So some of the unique T-MOSAIC contributions in my mind are going to be providing length and taking advantage of the long-term existing data sets that are collected before and after MOSAIC. Depth, we will also have the opportunity to do process-based studies over land. These very detailed, interdisciplinary, and full suite of measurements that they're making in the Arctic Ocean. Some of those measurements have been made for decades now at some of the land-based stations. And there's certain sites that are qualify as super sites that have, from the atmospheric standpoint, a lot of the active sensors that they're going to have at MOSAIC, as well as we know, but we haven't interacted too much with all the ecosystem and terrestrial people that we could have at some of these locations. There is breadth, which is expanding the central Arctic view to a wider geographic theater of Arctic change. And finally, there's applications, which will be expanding the focus to the needs of stakeholders, et cetera. So just as an example of length studies, one of the things that we can do is, here's an example for, I think for the Tixie station, what the temperature distributions look like for a period since 1936. And I've done this for a global climate model, for a reanalysis, and from the actual data. And you can see, even for these three data sets, there's a lot of disagreements about what's going on with the tails and the inflection points. And so when we do studies at MOSAIC, T-MOSAIC is going to be able to provide a lot of context as we look at individual events about where they're sitting on the tails or within these mean distributions. For depth studies, again, here's an example of something that Nate Miller did with Matt Shoup and their research group. And they're talking again about the details of the surface energy budget response to forcing terms and how those are represented in models. One reason I put this particular example here is when I talked to my ecosystem and permafrost colleagues, one of the data sets that we have a lot of expertise with is details of the radiation, the long-welling shortwave radiation, and how that is that affecting things like with snow depth, snow melt rates, length of season, PAR, radiation that's available, et cetera. And in terms of breadth studies, the other thing that we have done with ISOA, and I know that the ecosystem and permafrost people can do equivalently, is putting things in geographical context. This is in showing how that the Arctic is not one region, it's a set of complex different regions. And here is a seasonality of aerosol optical properties in the Arctic that's shown over an annual cycle for 6 of our stations. And a lot of these details. This particular study sort of is a messenger to us about how hard it'll be able to do these kind of studies, because this required a huge amount of work to take different data sets and make them interoperable so that we could actually come up with the same variable that would be comparable on the same plot. For applications, I think that this is something that we are just starting to brainstorm about. I think for the NSF program of navigating the new Arctic, I think our research is going to be very oriented, and this is just sort of a shopping list that I've come up with. I think there's a lot of things that we can be adding to with this. So I think conceptually there's a couple ways to look at MOSAIC or T-MOSAIC right now. We've got this MOSAIC central station. They're going to have a number of distributed measurements and observatories around the central station. There's going to be a whole community that I think we're going to be looking at coastal exchanges, and I think those won't be just geophysical. I think that there's fish that pass back and forth out of the ocean and into the river systems. And there's a lot of transport. There's got a lot of action in the coastal exchanges, which the T-MOSAIC team is starting to outline in their science document. And then we get out into the terrestrial process studies, and then we get out to the rest of the world. And that's when we start getting to these long-term transport studies and answering questions like, how much is the changing Arctic affecting mid-latitude weather? So I'm just going to end with a couple of graphics here. We have a graphic here we developed for ISOA where we put the T-MOSAIC ship in there. The graphic design artist, I wanted her to kind of put in things that indicated that we weren't just looking at the atmosphere and all these different things in the atmosphere. We're very interested in what's going on with the permafrost. We're very aware of the fact that the Arctic summer and the Arctic winter is two different systems that we need to study separately. And this morning I put in one of the above aircraft just because I know that the aircraft campaigns and the amount of data that's going to be collected in the air with some of these NASA campaigns are also going to be very important to putting together a complete picture story here. I'm going to end up with saying everybody, when they ever have a project like this, MOSAIC or ISOA or any of the WMO stations or navigating the navigating the new Arctic, everybody always talks about how we're going to do something with data. And I just want to caution everybody, it is my experience that doing something with data is going to be enormously difficult. It's going to be more than just saying my data is going to be available. It's going to be more than just having a DOI. It's going to be more than just writing metadata so that the data centers can locate your data. We currently have a project right now with the WL Polar Prediction Project and the Europolar Prediction. And what we are doing is we've got all the ISO observatories. They've all got this giant mess of different instruments. And what we are trying to do is come up with these merged observatory data files where we put everything from one observatory into one netcdf file, which is matching up with these model output files that are being developed by the numerical weather prediction centers. And I hope eventually by maybe some of the GCM modelers as well and some of the reanalyses. And we are campaigning that the MOSAIC ship will also be creating these merged data files that will basically have all the information collected in sort of one place with the same variable names, the same time steps. And this is not, in my mind, not limited to the atmospheric variables. If you look at all these models, these are either coupled models or models that are evolving to be coupled models. And so when they have their list of common model output files, they have lots of snow and terrestrial. What they do not have yet, but I think could be in there, is ecosystem variables, so that we really could get everything on the same page so that we can address this challenge of doing system science studies. And I'm going to end there, and I'm going to let Michelle take it. Okay. So I've hit stop share now.
All right, and I am sharing my screen.
As Michelle is getting her presentation, does anyone have a question for Taneil? We've got time for a question. If not, we can hold them until the end.
Hi, I'm Michael Pallas. I have a quick question.
Okay.
It looked like a lot of the way the T-MOSAIC was looking at the interaction was more of a Arctic Ocean to land influence and not so much a land back to the ocean and ocean ice formation. I was just curious if there will be an interest in it looking at influences both ways. Does that make sense?
I think the answer to that is yes. I think that MOSAIC was capturing the question was about how the land and, transports from lower latitudes was going to be affecting the Arctic Ocean. So T-MOSAIC was trying to sort of pick up on more of what wasn't covered in the primary MOSAIC science question. So I think the two of them together, the answer is absolutely yes. We would be looking at back and forth processes.
Great, thanks.
Okay, should I go ahead and get started?
Yeah.
All right. Well, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Michelle Mack from Northern Arizona University, and I'm a terrestrial ecosystem ecologist. I work on coupling of carbon and nutrient cycles, that I'm particularly interested in changing disturbance regimes in Arctic tundra and boreal forests. And I also happen to be the US representative to the Terrestrial Working Group of the International Arctic Science Committee. And this group meets annually and discusses sort of the current state of the knowledge in Arctic science and what we can do as an international community to improve that knowledge. So it's really a coordinating group, a group that generates lots of ideas, and a group for networking Arctic scientists. So in 2017, we met in Prague, and I was there, and also Vladimir Romanovsky as the other US rep. And the group was having this discussion of, well, it was MOSAIC envy. We're like, why don't we have anything as cool as MOSAIC? This decadal long planning for this massive coordinated effort. And that's where Warwick Vincent, who's an eco-hydrologist from Canada, came up with the idea of having a terrestrial extension of MOSAIC. And I remember him saying, what if we could amplify the insights from MOSAIC by extending onto the land surface? So we were all very excited about that because we were talking a lot about teleconnections and climate, about climatic connectivity between the Arctic Ocean and terrestrial regions. And then I was very enthused about things like fire regimes, fire weather, thermokarst weather, and also changes in Arctic vegetation, such as Arctic greening, Arctic browning, the northward migration of the tree line. All of these things we know interacts strongly in the system level context with both the climate around the Arctic Ocean and in some cases with the extent of sea ice. Okay, so that's a little background of where this came from. So Warwick Vincent and a Portuguese ecosystem ecologist, Jose Canario, ran with this and started to get together interests in their countries for some support for this project. And actually, Joao was able to get support to start a secretariat in Portugal where they're trying to coordinate information on people that are interested, for people that are interested in T-MOSAIC. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the next slide. So at this point, we've already heard what the focal question is, but I think there are some really exciting and unique parts of T-MOSAIC. And the first is that we really are focused on the permafrost region. And I like the idea that we're both interested in how the Arctic Ocean dynamics are affecting terrestrial regions, but also how changes in these terrestrial regions, particularly the continental regions, are feeding back to the Arctic Ocean. And I think the other thing that's pretty unique about T-MOSAIC is indicated by this from Canada here, and that is the idea that we are going to incorporate people and the needs of Arctic communities into this study. So as Taneil mentioned, the focus of T-MOSAIC really moves from the ocean through the coastal zone, both the aquatic and then the terrestrial component of the coastal zone, and then into the continental zone. And this has been the gradient or the organizing gradient for thinking about the measurements that will be made. And this is sort of the conceptual model or the implementation model that Warwick and Joao have been shopping around. And it's pretty general. You know, it's things that many people interested in system level science are focused on. So one thing that Taneil and I talked about this morning is, well, if we have to make this more concrete and less general, what are the types of questions that people will be excited about or interested in participating in answering at this circumpolar scale? And Taneil came up with what she called her shopping list. I have a list of questions that we've discussed in the Terrestrial Working Group And so these really are, their ecosystem ecology perspective, but they're things that I think there's a fairly large interest in understanding. So understanding how changes in climate and sea ice link to weather events in coastal and continental regions. Probably many of you remember the 2007 Anatuvik River fire on the North Slope of Alaska. We know that there are very unique sea ice conditions during that year that led to the formation of this high pressure dome over the North Slope that sat there until the hugest fire on record that year, and certainly on the record for the North Slope, burned Arctic tundra. So we're really interested in how changes in climate can affect these climate sensitive disturbances. We're interested in how changes in Arctic Ocean climate are leading to changes in precipitation in terrestrial regions. Certainly the question of whether terrestrial Arctic will be wetter or drier, that's a tipping point for understanding many different things about terrestrial feedbacks to climate. We're interested in tundra and tree line shrub productivity, even productivity extending into the boreal forest, trends of greening and browning, and shifts in the major structural aspects of biomes that we know are occurring in response to changing climate and changing climate teleconnections. And then finally, we've discussed permafrost temperature dynamics and how these are linked across these gradients from the Arctic Ocean into the continental land masses. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go over the goals that I have for our discussion here and the information that I would like to collect from this webinar. And there's sort of three levels of goals. The first is that we'd like to identify some more US individuals or interdisciplinary projects or even networks, people that are willing to engage collaboratively in planning with the International T-MOSAIC team. So we've had Taneil so far representing the US, but other than Vladimir and I attending some of the discussions, we haven't had a lot of US involvement. So if there are people out there that are excited about this, that would like to participate, I think that it would be awesome to have more US representation. Now the next meeting for T-MOSAIC is going to be at ArcticNet 2018, and I think in the next slide I have a link for that in Quebec City, but that overlaps exactly with all of the AGU activities on Arctic and boreal vulnerability and resilience. And so, yeah, it's a difficult time to get representatives to Canada. We are also going to have a T-MOSAIC meeting at the Arctic Science Summit Week in Arkhangelsk, Russia in 2018. But
19.
Oh, 2019. Sorry. Thank you, Vladimir. I'm glad you're out there. But I think it's going to be very difficult to get a lot of people there. We do, however, have travel support for early career scientists. So if someone's out there that this resonates with, I would love to go to Arkhangelsk and talk about T-MOSAIC and represent for the United States, let me know, because I think that could be a great opportunity. Okay, so that's sort of one of the more diffuse goals. A more specific goal is that we would like to identify existing or planned US data streams that we can contribute to T-MOSAIC. So these have to be data streams that are in place during the 2020 calendar year. They have to be publicly archived or publicly available. We need to have an owner or a spokesperson that's willing to be the champion or the caretaker of that data set and to be willing to interface with the T-MOSAIC team. And then we've been talking about, the IS group has been talking about having really strong US representation at the 2020 Arctic Science Summit Week in Iceland, which we think will be much more amenable to bringing a large number of people from our community. And there we hope, so at that point, T-MOSAIC, the calendar year has already started, but having people who are there who are representing these data streams could be really exciting, and we could generate some momentum for US participation. Okay, so then the final thing is that I think we need to, if we can, identify new interdisciplinary groups that are interested in syntheses of data. So Taneil mentioned that, the most difficult part of much of this is getting all of these disparate data streams into a form where they can be used together. And that to me sounds like a Navigating the New Arctic proposal, or perhaps an Arctic Data Center data working group. This is something that I think will require additional funding, but if there's someone out there for whom this resonates with, please let me know and I'd be happy to help facilitate. Okay, so I'm just gonna quickly run over three pieces of information that I put in here for you. And the first is upcoming workshops, so you have more information there in the web links. The next thing is thinking about data management for this. And Taneil showed me her website, the IASOA, which it doesn't show the tick marks here, but it's a fantastic list of these different data streams that are collected throughout this Pan-Arctic network. So we were envisioning, adding to the number of rows with more terrestrial variables, and then adding to the number of columns. So having data observing stations that are farther inland. So that's sort of a framework for how we might envision moving forward with data. And another framework, I think Liz Hoy is out there. She's been very involved in managing the NASA Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment database. And so, for instance, for above, we have these geographically explicit interfaces where you can look at what sort of data is available in what region. So those are sort of two things that we thought about. This would really facilitate discussions about how to move forward. Okay, so I just want to go back to my goals for discussion, and I want to open up to hear questions from the community that either Taneil or I can answer, and then open up for brainstorming about whether there are people or data streams that are interested in participating.
Thank you, Michelle. That was really great. I think this was very useful. And please, if you have questions, why don't you just ask them or type them into the box if you have no microphone.
So Michelle, this is, I'll say that certainly our site science team, which is funded by the Department of Energy and which uses and tries to be a spokesperson for the data coming from Barrow and Electuck Point, we'd be very interested in engaging with you to figure out how we can support T-MOSAIC.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say that one thing that I see a lot of, and T-MOSAIC is, first of all, T-MOSAIC is a developing framework. So I think that, as Michelle said, that they are very welcoming of active members that would like to contribute how they're going to be thinking about things and the kind of structures that they're going to be building for scientific cooperation internationally. I think one of the things that would be really great is if we started putting together sort of little interdisciplinary teams instead of and break down those barriers between the separate, disciplines that we normally work within. And I think Michelle has gone exactly in the right direction for us, is starting to compile a list of questions that need to be answered that would be the basis for these interdisciplinary teams.
Michelle, I have a question in regard to the data availability. Is it going to be open access? Or what's the idea? People who have unpublished data, for example, will they feel comfortable sharing, or what do they need to be aware of?
Christina, that's a really good question, and I know that it's super complicated, and I don't have a good answer, but my thought was, as a U.S. community, if we were going to offer data that was collected by agencies or by individuals, we would only want to offer data that was publicly available or that had a person who created that data attached to it who wanted to participate.
I agree. I think that's important. And maybe it could even almost be a requirement for data to be included, that it is accessible and available to the community.
That's right. We know that any NSF-funded data at this point has to be archived on the Arctic Data Portal. And so I think, well, our goal is to make data from NSF, from NASA, publicly available, although that's not always, it's not always the data that you need that's publicly available. You often have to go back to the data originator and have some sort of digested form brought forward.
So data availability, I will say right now, is going to be totally insufficient. Just to say that you have data and you're making it available. Like I said, I think that we're going to have to level up our thinking so that we can make our data so it is, as Michelle said, digestible to each other.
I don't know if you read that, but Helen had a question whether, what did it say? Whether data for modeling simulations are also of interest or just observations.
Personally, I think from model simulations, it'll be critical because I think the models are going to be able to provide the linkages for us to understand actually the processes. We can observationally infer the processes, but we really need the physics in the models, I think, to really come to a full understanding.
Helen, does that answer your question? Okay, good. I see you now. Yeah, good.
Hi, Taneil. This is Peter Griffith with Above. And hi, Michelle.
Hey.
I know that ISOA thing that you that you put up. I guess Michelle put that up. I think that Sandy Starkweather had a lot to do with that, if I recall correctly. And some of the data sharing goals that you talked about sound a lot like what Peter Pulsifer and that team has been trying to do with IARPC. And I wonder if you or some other people on the call might be up to date on what what that IARPC committee has achieved. Liz might know a little bit about it actually. I've been kind of in and out of focus on the success and the progress of that committee.
I think that, this is Liz Hoy, I think that that data working group has still been working on setting things up and figuring out how to have their data, the metadata, kind of cross from one system to another. So I haven't heard from that group so much recently, but it does seem like what they're trying to do also. It'd be worth chatting with them, I think.
I think it's what they're trying to do in the long term. I have deliberately at Arctic Science Summit Week, and there have been some, NOAA had an internal meeting with environmental data management with 250 NOAA data people there, which is not the kind of meetings that I normally go to. I have been making an effort to go to those and hear what they're doing. I think they're still in the stage of developing an architecture. I think they're very, very far away from coming together, being able to bring together data set. I mean, it can be something as simple as we have different variable names for the same things.
Yeah.
Or worse, that we've got, there's a whole person on the Arctic Site MIP team, and all he does is talk about the names for the variables.
Right.
We actually got this idea for these merged data files from NASA because you guys apparently had the same problem where you would have an aircraft with 20 different instruments on it, and they would go into different data files, and you came up with a system putting together flight merged data files, and so we're kind of trying to follow that. So it's going to be an extraordinarily difficult effort so that the scientists can actually get to the data in the form that they need it so that they can actually do their analyses.
It's Martin Jeffries, if I could add a couple of items.
Go ahead, Martin.
Oh, good, you can hear me, sorry. So Jose Canario represented Portugal at the Arctic Science Forum of the Second Arctic Science Ministerial, was it 3 weeks ago in Berlin? And he spoke exclusively as a panelist about T-MOSAIC. So he did a really good job of raising some awareness of T-MOSAIC in a room of roughly 300 people from 30 or more different countries. Peter Pulsifer, who we all know, was also a panelist at the Arctic Science Forum, and no surprise, Peter spoke about data and data systems and so on. So there may already be a connection there, and I think certainly one that's worth pursuing, and if someone wants to take it on themselves to connect Peter and Jao, or anyone on this call who is part of the T-MOSAIC Executive Committee, I think that would be a good idea. My second point was, I'm now at CREL, the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab in Hanover, New Hampshire, and I will do what I can to raise awareness of T-MOSAIC amongst the terrestrial ecosystem folks here at CREL, and I encourage them to get more involved. And I will find out what kind of investigations and data sets they might have that would be relevant to T-MOSAIC. That's all, thanks.
Well, one thing that I think that we could get out of today's discussion that would be very interesting, like I said, I think we need to start off with our science questions. And I think Michelle's done a great job of starting that list. And I'm wondering, as part of the discussion group from this joint collaborations team meeting, if that's something that people could start trying to formulate what question it is that they'd actually want to be answering with a combined T-MOSAIC framework. So that's sort of a proposal to the group.
Right, my thought would be, what questions are people most excited about that could be asked across this ocean to terrestrial gradient?
And, for the US, we have these opportunities now, like with the NSF navigating the new Arctic. So I would think that you would think of those questions as being the basis for proposals that would be going to that call.
Could we have the slides move back to the questions again, Michelle or Meredith, who can?
Okay. I mean, these are pretty specific to my interests, but I'm just trying to give you guys an example of the sorts of things that we've been discussing.
I mean, for instance, for the atmospheric community and listening to some of the questions that we have, like from the terrestrial and permafrost, we would be wanting to answer questions like, is the Arctic getting cloudier? And more specifically, how is the characteristics of Arctic clouds evolving? Because they have such a strong effect on the surface radiation budget.
Right, and Taneil, thinking about how far those effects extend into the continental land masses.
And how do those effects get transported by, just by the general circulation?
Right, right. A lot of the questions then that link something like that to productivity are questions that we would probably have to look at over longer time frames. So for instance, we could look at tree or shrub ring growth records, or we could look at NDVI time series, but being able to link those with this more systems level atmospheric perspective.
Yeah, I think in general, it's Vladimir. So all of these connections and relations needs much longer time of observations and comparison, but I think it's very good reason to establish the connection between groups to address this. So it's not necessarily that only data from these 2 years will be used, of course not, but that will be good reason to get together permafrost scientists and atmospheric scientists and terrestrial ecosystem scientists and ocean. And so we are definitely not kind of limit ourselves to analyze these 2 years of data. Of course, it needs to be much longer, records of available data. And I would kind of extend a little bit this question about cloudiness to, well, what comes from the clouds, precipitation. So how the open water during the summer impact precipitation and how far inland. So that question will be very, very interesting, and not only during the summertime, but also during the winter time, and in terms of snow, but also very important question, which is kind of getting more and more important, is rain on snow events, which are getting more and more common. How all these events, they related to dynamics in the Arctic Ocean or some seas around the Arctic Ocean as well. So I think that will be very important questions to address.
It's
Thanks.
Martin. Vladimir's point leads me to ask, to what extent land glaciers and the Greenland ice sheet, which are a major component of the terrestrial system in the Arctic, have been discussed as part of the early T-MOSAIC discussions, since precipitation is a key factor in the mass balance of the Northern Hemisphere glaciers and the Greenland ice sheet, and thus global sea level.
Right. I don't think that I have been present for any discussions of glacial mass balance with T-MOSAIC. Taneil, or
Yeah.
I'm thinking right now you've located a hole where we're looking there. When they think about the cryosphere, it's just permafrost right now.
Yeah, well, I think this is kind of historically, because this T-MOSAIC idea came out of the Terrestrial Working Group, and Cryosphere Working Group is not as actively involved in that. I think we definitely should kind of reach out to Cryosphere Working Group, and I believe they will be interested in to participate.
so for that group out there, is there anyone that feels excited about participating in the spin-up of T-MOSAIC? So someone who would like to be a representative to the steering committee, for instance. How about, is there anyone that feels excited about contributing some of their data and sort of coming with their data and participating?
Maybe people are not only comfortable doing this online, you can always email either Michelle or me or someone, and we can then distribute the information. If you don't want to volunteer in a 42 people conference call, that's fine, but you can email.
Yeah, maybe we could send out, Christina, just a survey to the working groups.
Yes, yeah, actually a good idea, a follow-up, yeah.
3 short questions to answer. Enthusiasm high, enthusiasm low.
Yeah, and permafrost temperature group definitely will participate and submit data. Data availability from different countries is still a question, but at least North America and Russia probably, well, North America, I would say Alaska. Canada is a little bit more complicated, but we definitely will be providing our data in, pretty much time frame what usually used in Arctic Observing Network requirements. So pretty much immediately after processing of the field data.
Michelle, I could, in principle, volunteer myself and the DACs and, Liz to try to facilitate any integration of above, NASA-sponsored data into the effort as that develops, particularly emphasizing the data that have gone as far as being fully archived. Because it's right now, Liz and I and others are already spending an awful lot of time trying to help integrate data just across above.
Right.
Which, as you know, has challenges in itself. But once we have things at the DAC level, it ought to be a lot easier to work with whatever develops in data sharing with this.
Peter, is there a plan right now for a 2020 airborne campaign?
That's the notional timeline, is that there would be another big airborne campaign in 2020, but Hank has not shared his thoughts on the timeline of how that would be solicited.
Because that's sort of the one contemporaneous huge amount of data that potentially could be collected during the T-MOSAIC calendar year.
So this is Scott Getz. Yeah, I'm interested to hear about this. Maybe I'm excited about it even. I'm glad that Michelle, as someone who's very involved in above, is part of this, and that Peter's volunteering in some sense to try to coordinate the data side of things. I think that's part of what is our obligation under these large interdisciplinary campaigns like above to provide to the community. So I think that's all good, and I will do what I can to help facilitate that in my role with above. I wanted to make people aware that there are also other NASA campaigns in the planning stages, at least, that maybe many of you already know about. Arctic Colors, which is export of carbon, nutrients, materials through rivers into the Arctic. So that's something that's in the planning stages, but would be another large NASA-initiated effort. So those kind of efforts, trying to coordinate these large multidisciplinary efforts is always a challenge, but I think if we have representation from each of them, then that'll help.
Yeah, so this is Michelle. I think that having representatives that could participate in some of these international discussions would be really great. So for instance, I think it'd be nice having a representative from above. Maybe it's me or maybe not, but depending on what happens with this next cycle. But I think it would really facilitate international collaboration if we had some people who are willing to engage and to travel to some of these meetings.
Hi, Michelle, and everyone else on the call. This is Amy Breen at University of Alaska Fairbanks. I am traveling to 2019 Arctic Science Summit Week, and we are also having a Arctic Vegetation Archive workshop as part of that, and really trying to get the Russian side of the archive built up and supported, so meeting with Russian collaborators. And I think either I can volunteer myself, but it may be have to talk with Skip Walker as well, who's the lead on that project. But I think that we're definitely interested in contributing data from the US and then other data that we're bringing in together from the international perspective.
That's great. So thinking of having Amy there,
yeah,
representing both the Vegetation Archive and as a source of data for T-MOSAIC, as well as representing US interests. I think that's great. Yeah, and I don't know, anyone else that's out there that thinks, I want to go to Arkhangelash, please contact me, because we do have travel support for early career scientists and maybe for later career scientists, depending on what happens with this meeting.
We've also got some questions, a question and then a comment from Jeremy in the chat box, noting that he could be a USGS representative, and he lists his interests there. And then Scott has a question also, asking about overlap with communities and sea ice effects on permafrost thaw.
I don't think I have an answer to that question. Is that Scott Getz or a different Scott?
No, it's a different Scott.
Scott Focus from, he's in Canada. I don't know if he's still online or not.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I'm from Canada, so I'm not based in the US. I'm from the US, so I'm kind of infiltrating on this call here. Yeah, that comment was just going back to the brainstorming maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago. So I don't mean to bring the conversation backwards, but I just thought I'd throw that question out there, so thanks.
And so you're thinking of sea ice and coastal erosion?
I guess as an example, yeah, things like that, and just links with engineering, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Is there anyone on the call from some of the groups that are looking at coastal erosion? Maybe no one's on the call, but there certainly, I think, are some groups that are interested in that, and there are some data streams that might be useful.
Yeah, I can answer to this part of RATIC. So in Archangels also, it is planned to have a RATIC meeting, and we have some also small amount of money for mostly for young researchers and for some Russian participants. So it will be probably very kind of closely related discussions, RATIC and T-MOSAIC. And there is some good relationship between the leaders of both of the projects. So they're talking to each other, I know. And I think definitely the RATIC will be represented at discussions on T-MOSAIC. And then hopefully there will be some plan of collecting specific data on that. And after that, so analysis of data, also kind of joint analysis of RATIC and T-MOSAIC after data will be collected. So I think that will be covered during the Archangels meeting, and hopefully it will give some beginning of the good synthesis process after data will be collected and brought together.
Neat, thanks for clarifying.
So it's Martin. Somebody referred to communities a moment ago, and I don't think they were referring to communities in the biological ecosystem context, rather communities of people, the people who live in the Arctic. Going back to the Arctic Science Ministerial and the Arctic Science Forum, there were Indigenous peoples representatives there on both days. They were quite vocal, and they are very interested in working in partnership with researchers and scientists in the traditional sense, if you will, and combining our way of investigating the world and their way of seeing the world and knowing the world in a, say, a co-production of knowledge approach. And those who have read the NSF solicitation for navigating the new Arctic will be aware that NSF is very interested in receiving proposals that include Arctic indigenous peoples taking a co-production of knowledge approach, and so on. So I think it's definitely, from a T-MOSAIC perspective, it's definitely something worth bearing in mind and pursuing that to the extent possible.
Great, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I would say we should wrap this up. If there are any follow-up questions, feel free to email Michelle Mack directly or Taneil or even me, and I can forward the emails. If there are some important member updates from either of the teams that take up like 1 or 2 minutes, feel free to mention these right now, and I'll open the space for something that's not necessarily related to T-MOSAIC.
Okay, I have a quick update, and that is that there is a new self-forming team within IARPC called the Diversity and Inclusion Working Group, and they will be having their first meeting at the beginning of January, and the idea is to have a space to discuss issues of diversity and inclusion in Arctic research. And I'm sharing the link for that now, and I'm also sharing the email addresses of Taneil and Michelle in the chat box, if anyone wants
Great.
to.
Thank you. Yeah, the Permafrost team will not be meeting in December, since many of us are going to AGU and will be busy with that, but we will be back in the new year.
And I can speak for the atmosphere team, since Heiss has had to drop off, but they are having a pre-AGU show and tell on the first week of in the first week of December. It will be on December 4th. So that meeting is coming up for atmosphere.
Great, thank you. I think we will end it here, unless there is something very important. Meredith?
I have a quick question. This is Michelle. Is there a log of the chat box? Could that be pasted into a document?
Yes, yep, I will capture it in the notes.
Okay, great. And then I will go through these questions carefully. It looks like there's a lot of good information.
Cool. Great, thank you all for calling in, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.